Part 4. Repatriation. Initially, I hadn't intended to travel at all during the pandemic, but over the course of 2020 it became clear that staying in Abu Dhabi for another year would be untenable. At the start of the pandemic, my then wife had lost her job as a mediator at the Louvre Abu Dhabi, along with most of their front of house staff, and despite months of looking, we simply couldn't find another suitable position for her. So, after a lot of soul searching and debate, it was decided that she would go back to the US to look for work and set up house on the understanding that I'd join her once my teaching contract for the year had expired. It didn't work out that way, but it seemed like a reasonable plan at the time. Besides, we'd been thinking about leaving the UAE for a few years anyway, and the pandemic was really the kick up the backside we needed. As we knew I'd need to be in the UK to sort out my spousal visa, and that I wouldn't be able to leave the US while my green card application was being processed, it seemed clear that if I was going to hike the path, it had to be now or never. However, by the time I was ready to fly over, it was the summer of 2021, and the British government was operating its traffic light system for international travel. According to this system, countries were designated as red, amber or green depending on their perceived COVID risk. Travel into the UK from red list countries was prohibited unless you were a UK citizen or permanent resident, you had a negative COVID test just before travelling, and you paid for 10 days of hotel quarantine starting at a cost of £1,750 per adult. Travel from amber list countries was again only permitted for UK citizens and residents, but because the risk of these countries was seen as lower, you were allowed to self-isolate at home for the 10 days. On the other hand, travel from green list countries was essentially open if you could produce a negative test result. Unfortunately, despite having a national vaccination programme, bi-weekly PCR testing for pretty much everyone, and an efficient test and trace system, the UAE was placed on the red list for some reason known only to government bureaucrats. Now, I understand the need for travel restrictions during a pandemic. I understand the need for quarantine to help prevent the spread of new variants into the country. I even think it's reasonable to ask people who have chosen to travel at these times to contribute to the cost of quarantine if they can afford to do so. However, in my mind, if the risk of a virus is so great as to require quarantine, then it should be a proper quarantine, with no half measures and no gaps. Otherwise, what's the point? Unfortunately, having gone through it, I can tell you that UK hotel quarantine was laughably unfit for purpose. The border force and airport staff at Heathrow were wonderful. They were courteous, they were professional, they were efficient. However, almost everything after that was a bit of a shit show. Not only did they mix passengers from multiple flights who had travelled from multiple destinations on the same buses, social distancing was all but ignored. In fact, at one point, seats that had been specifically cordoned off to allow social distancing were filled with passengers, even though this put the bus beyond its supposed COVID-safe capacity. On top of this, our bus driver refused to keep his mask on and spent at least 20 minutes running between other buses to chat with his friends, despite the obvious risk of cross-transmission. Not to be outshone, the hotel security guards, many of whom looked and acted like 12-year-olds on work experience, again wouldn't keep their masks on and tended to treat guests with a mixture of curt indifference and passive irritation. All in all, it quickly became clear that hotel quarantine was not being run in a way that either protected the public from COVID or offered value for money to those who had paid for it. So, what was the point? Well, everyone there was paying at least £1,750, if not a great deal more for the experience, and that money must have been going in someone's pocket. Given the UK government's track record when it comes to cronyism during the pandemic, I'll let you reach your own conclusions. Either way, the 10 days passed quickly enough and I was back in Weymouth by the start of August. As I mentioned earlier, Weymouth is right in the middle of a number of different sections of the path. From here you can walk west along the Fleet Lagoon to Abbotsbury, east to Durdle Door and Lulworth Cove, or south around the Isle of Portland. Depending on which direction you choose, you'll encounter rough ground, smooth ground, steep ascents, level walking at sea level, or cliffs overlooking isolated bays. Essentially, you'll encounter most of the different types of terrain you'll come across on the path, apart from sand dunes, making it the perfect training ground. So, that's what I did. I spent a couple of weeks walking these sections as much as I could, building up my mileage and adding weight until I was comfortable with a 15-kilo load. Then it was time to start for real. I'd originally planned to start the first week of September, as this is usually about the time that children go back to school in the UK and most of the holiday makers go home. However, in the end I decided to move this up to the 24th of August. There'd already been a couple of semi-serious storms earlier in the year, and late autumn, early winter has always been the stormiest time of year in the southwest. So, given that it would take me around 6 to 8 weeks to complete the path, I thought getting a head start wouldn't be the worst idea. So, on the 23rd of August 2021, I boarded a train ready to begin my attempt on the South West Coast path.